Hello and welcome to Umber Dreams Archives. I'm glad you've joined me, ready to slow down, breathe deeply, and let your thoughts drift back through the quiet corridors of time. This is your moment to leave the noise of the day behind, to step away from screens and deadlines and the relentless rush of now, and step gently into the dry earth of central China, where an emperor's fear of death created something the world had never seen. An army that would stand guard not for years or decades, but for eternity itself. Here, in this space between past and present, we wander together through chambers buried so deep that daylight hasn't touched them in more than 2,000 years. We stand among warriors made of clay, each face different from the next, each expression frozen in eternal vigilance. We imagine the hands that shaped them, the artisans who worked in secrecy, knowing they were creating something that would outlast empires, outlast dynasties, outlast the very memory of their own names. Each episode here isn't just about dates and dynasties. It's not about memorizing emperors or battles or the rise and fall of kingdoms catalogued in textbooks. It's about the lives lived. The craftsman pressing his thumb into wet clay to give a warrior's face character. The soldier who stood as a model not knowing he would be immortalized in terracotta. The emperor who lay awake at night terrified of the darkness waiting beyond his final breath. It's about the obsession with immortality. The beauty born from fear, the mystery that still waits beneath a hill in Shanxi province, sealed and silent, guarding secrets the earth is not yet ready to reveal. If you enjoy these quiet journeys through time, a like and subscribe help keep this channel alive, help us continue exploring together. But for now, you don't need to do anything but listen. In the 3rd century before the Common Era, China was not yet China as we know it today. It was a land fractured into warring kingdoms, each fighting for survival, each believing it alone held the mandate of heaven. For more than 200 years, the period known as the Warring States had turned the Yellow River Valley into a crucible of violence and innovation, where military strategy evolved with desperate speed and philosophy bloomed in the shadows of endless conflict. 7 major kingdoms battled for supremacy. Armies clashed with bronze weapons that would soon give way to iron. Philosophers wandered from court to court, offering wisdom to rulers who often ignored them. Confucius had walked these roads, teaching virtue and proper conduct. Laozi had disappeared into the western mountains, leaving behind the cryptic wisdom of the Tao. And in the state of Qin, on the western frontier, a young prince named Ying was learning that power was the only truth that mattered. Qin was considered barbaric by the eastern kingdoms, a rough border state where military discipline trumped cultural refinement. But what Qin lacked in poetry, it made up for in organization. Its armies were ruthless and efficient. Its laws were harsh but clear. And when Ying ascended the throne at age 13 in 247 BCE, he inherited not just a kingdom, but an ideology that valued strength above all else. The world he grew up in was one of constant threat. Assassins were common. Betrayal was expected. Trust was a luxury no ruler could afford. By the time he reached manhood, Ying had survived multiple assassination attempts, crushed rebellions, and watched his own mother conspire against him. These experiences didn't make him cruel. They made him certain that the only way to achieve peace was through absolute control, certain that the only way to achieve immortality was through absolute power. One by one, he began to conquer the other kingdoms. His armies moved with mechanical precision, absorbing territories, eliminating rivals, unifying a fractured land under a single iron will. By 221 BCE, the last enemy kingdom had fallen. For the first time in centuries, China was whole, and Ying, no longer merely a king, took a new title that had never existed before, Huangdi, the first emperor. He was 38 years old. He had unified China. He had standardized the currency, the written language, the width of cart axles so that all wheels would fit the same ruts in the same roads stretching across his empire. He had connected and extended the defensive walls in the north into what would one day become the Great Wall. He had burned books that contradicted his worldview and buried scholars alive who dared to question his authority. But none of it was enough, because no matter how many kingdoms he conquered, no matter how many walls he built, no matter how many dissenting voices he silenced, there was one enemy he could not defeat. Death was coming for him, as it came for every man, and the thought terrified him more than any army ever could. So he began to build something else. Not a palace for his living days, but a palace for eternity. He ordered the construction of a tomb so vast, so elaborate, so filled with everything he would need in the afterlife, that it would take 700,000 workers nearly 40 years to complete. And at its entrance, standing guard in endless formation, would be an army unlike anything the world had ever seen. They would be made of clay, they would be life-sized, and each one would be unique, a perfect replica of the soldiers who had won him his empire. They would stand in battle formation, weapons ready, eyes fixed forward, waiting for enemies that would never come, guarding an emperor who believed that death could be conquered if only he built his defences deep enough. The farmers working the fields above had no idea what lay beneath their feet. Centuries would pass, dynasties would rise and fall, the location of the tomb would be lost, then half remembered, then dismissed as legend. But deep in the earth, in the darkness, the army would remain, patient and silent, waiting for the day when a light would find them again. March 1974 was a drought year in Shanxi province. The winter wheat had been thin, spring promised little better. Near the village of Xi'an, about a mile east of Mount Li, a group of farmers decided to dig a new well, hoping to tap into a water source that might save their crops from withering in the fields. The ground was hard, packed earth that had been farmed for generations. Yang Jifa, along with his 5 brothers and a neighbour, took turns with picks and shovels, working in the traditional way, digging straight down, hauling up buckets of dry soil. They weren't looking for anything but water. They had no reason to believe this spot was different from any other patch of farmland in the valley. 3 meters down, Yang's pick struck something solid. Not rock, the sound was different, more hollow, almost ceramic. He crouched down, brushing away soil with his hands, expecting pottery shards from some old household, the kind of thing farmers found all the time in a land where people had been living and dying for thousands of years. What emerged from the earth was not a broken pot. It was a face, eyes staring up from the darkness, features moulded in terracotta, covered in dust, but unmistakably human. Yang called the others over. They dug more carefully now, excavating around the head, revealing shoulders, a torso, hands positioned as if holding something long vanished. It was a statue, life-sized, buried standing upright. Then they found another, and another. The more they dug, the more figures appeared, all facing the same direction, all standing in neat rows as if waiting for orders that had never come. The farmers didn't know what to do. This was clearly something important, something old, something that belonged to authorities beyond their understanding. Word reached the local cultural office. Minor officials arrived, saw the figures, and immediately understood they were dealing with something extraordinary. By April, archaeologists from the Shanxi Provincial Institute were on site. By summer, the first formal excavations had begun, and the truth was starting to emerge from 22 centuries of darkness. This wasn't just a handful of statues. This was a military formation, soldiers arranged in battle order, precisely spaced, each carrying what would have been real weapons now decayed or stolen long ago. As the archaeologists carefully removed the soil, they revealed entire corridors filled with warriors, some standing at attention, others kneeling as if ready to fire crossbows, still others positioned as officers or commanders, their uniforms and postures indicating rank and role. The figures were not mass-produced. Each face was different, individually sculpted, with distinct features that suggested these were portraits, representations of real soldiers who had served in real armies. Some had moustaches, others were clean-shaven. Some had broad faces from the north, others narrower features from the south. The level of detail was astonishing, from the treads on the soles of their shoes to the knots in their hair, from the armour plates on their chests to the expressions in their eyes. But what truly shocked the archaeologists was the scale. As they expanded the excavation, they realized the well shaft had broken through into just one corner of something much larger. Ground-penetrating surveys suggested the underground complex covered 14,000 square meters, and this was only Pit 1. Further investigation revealed Pit 2, then Pit 3, each containing more warriors, more horses, more chariots, all part of a single massive construction project. The discovery made headlines across China, then around the world. Photographs of the excavation showed rows of warriors emerging from the earth like soldiers waking from an ancient sleep. Journalists tried to find words to describe the scale, the artistry, the sheer audacity of creating an entire army from clay. Nothing in the archaeological record compared to this. The pyramids were larger, but they were tombs for the dead. The Terracotta Army was different. It was an army that had been created specifically to serve in the afterlife, to protect an emperor who had believed death was just another territory that needed defending. By the end of 1974, the Chinese government had declared the site a priority of national importance. A museum was planned. Excavations would continue, and slowly, carefully, archaeologists would begin to piece together not just what had been buried, but why, and by whom, and what it meant that someone 22 centuries ago had looked at death and decided to build an army to fight it. The farmers who found that first warrior received a reward from the government, a modest sum by any measure. Young Jifa would later work at the museum, signing books for tourists, his photograph displayed as the man whose well had accidentally broken through into one of the greatest archaeological discoveries of the 20th century. But in that moment, standing in the spring sunlight with dirt under his fingernails and a terracotta face staring up from the earth, he couldn't have known that he had just opened a door into the mind of an emperor who had been dead for more than 2,000 years, but who had never stopped trying to defeat death itself. When the first photographs reached Beijing, senior officials in the cultural ministry assumed they were looking at an elaborate hoax. The timing seemed suspicious. China in 1974 was still emerging from the chaos of the Cultural Revolution, still rebuilding its relationship with ancient traditions that had been denounced as feudal and backward. The idea that farmers had stumbled upon an underground army of terracotta soldiers seemed too perfect, too convenient, too much like propaganda designed to prove China's historical greatness. But Yuan Zhongye, the archaeologist who led the first formal investigation, was meticulous in his documentation. He photographed each stage of the excavation. He brought in specialists from multiple institutions. He invited international observers, though political tensions meant few could come immediately. Every warrior that emerged was catalogued, measured, examined for signs of modern manufacture. The clay was analysed, the soil stratification was studied, and slowly, reluctantly, even the skeptics had to admit that this was real. The archaeological community outside China heard the news with a mixture of excitement and disbelief. Ancient Chinese historical texts had mentioned that Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor, had built an elaborate tomb, but most scholars had assumed those accounts were exaggerations, the kind of mythical embellishments that grow around powerful rulers after they die. The historian Sima Qian, writing a century after the emperor's death, had described a tomb containing palaces, towers, and rivers of mercury flowing mechanically through an underground landscape. These details had been dismissed as poetic fancy, the ancient equivalent of tall tales. Now, suddenly there was physical evidence that at least part of Sima Qian's account was accurate. If the Terracotta Army was real, what else might be true? International journals published articles debating the implications. Museums that had built their reputations on Greek and Roman antiquities suddenly found themselves scrambling to understand Chinese archaeology, a field that had been relatively isolated during the political upheavals of the mid-20th century. Public reaction in China was more complicated. For ordinary citizens who had spent years being told that the past was something to be overcome, that old traditions were chains holding back progress, the discovery of the terracotta warriors offered a different story. Here was proof that Chinese civilization had produced something magnificent, something that commanded respect and wonder, something that couldn't be dismissed or destroyed by political ideology. The warriors became symbols of cultural pride at a moment when China was beginning to reconsider its relationship with its own history. But there was also unease. The first emperor was not a beloved figure in Chinese memory. He was known as a tyrant, the man who had burned books and buried scholars alive, who had forced millions to labour on the Great Wall, who had ruled through fear and absolute control. The discovery of his underground army raised uncomfortable questions about what kind of greatness deserved celebration, what kind of legacy deserved preservation, whether magnificence excused cruelty, whether art created by forced labour could be admired without acknowledging the suffering that had made it possible. Archaeologists working at the site found themselves mediating between competing narratives. Nationalist voices wanted to emphasise the achievement, the technical sophistication, the evidence of Chinese civilization's advanced state of development in the 3rd century BCE. International observers wanted to focus on the universal human themes, the fear of death, the desire for immortality, the ways powerful individuals throughout history had tried to build monuments that would outlast their mortality. And beneath both perspectives ran a darker current, the knowledge that this wonder had been built by 700,000 labourers, many of whom had probably died during the construction, whose names were forgotten while the emperor they served was immortalised in clay. The warriors themselves offered no answers. They stood in their excavated pits, silent and patient. Their painted surfaces faded by time, their weapons long vanished, their purpose preserved in their postures, but their meaning open to interpretation. Were they guards or servants? Companions or prisoners? Had they been created out of genuine belief in an afterlife? Or were they simply the ultimate expression of an emperor's ego, a man so powerful that even death had to accommodate his desire for a retinue? The excavation continued through the autumn of 1974 and into 1975, revealing more warriors, more horses, more details of the underground complex. Each new discovery generated fresh headlines, fresh debates, fresh attempts to understand what it meant that someone had looked at death, the one universal human experience, and decided to treat it as just another military campaign that could be won with sufficient planning and sufficient force. And beneath all the academic discussion, beneath the national pride and international fascination, beneath the debates about meaning and memory and the price of greatness, there was a simpler reaction that almost everyone shared regardless of their background or beliefs. When you stood at the edge of Pit 1 and looked down at the rows of warriors emerging from the earth, when you saw their faces still bearing traces of individual personality after more than 2 millennia, when you realized the scale of what had been created and hidden and lost and found, there was only one honest response: wonder. Pure, uncomplicated wonder at what human beings could create when they believed eternity was watching. The historical texts had always been there, sitting in libraries, studied by scholars, known to anyone who had seriously engaged with ancient Chinese history. Sima Qian's records of the Grand Historian, written around 100 BCE, contained a detailed description of Qin Shi Huang's tomb. The account described a massive underground palace, with constellations marked on the ceiling in precious stones, rivers and seas represented by flowing mercury, crossbow traps set to kill intruders, and treasures beyond counting buried with the emperor's body. For 2,000 years, these descriptions were treated as exactly what they seemed to be: legends. No scholar seriously believed that mercury rivers flowed beneath a mountain. No one thought mechanical devices could function for centuries underground. The descriptions were understood as metaphorical, as the kind of mythological enhancement that ancient historians often added to make their accounts more dramatic, more worthy of the powerful figures they chronicled. But the discovery of the Terracotta Army changed the equation. If life-sized clay soldiers actually existed, arranged in military formation, each individually crafted, exactly as the ancient texts suggested, then what else might be real? Suddenly, those dismissed legends required reconsideration. Suddenly, the boundary between history and mythology became uncertain. The contradiction was profound. Modern archaeology operated on principles of skepticism, of demanding physical evidence, of treating ancient texts as sources to be questioned rather than authorities to be trusted. The scientific method required doubt, required verification, required proof that could be measured and tested and reproduced. But here was proof that the ancient accounts had been more accurate than modern skepticism had allowed. Archaeologists began to reread Sima Qian with new eyes. His description of the tomb's construction mentioned 700,000 workers, a number that had seemed impossibly large, the kind of exaggeration that ancient historians used when they wanted to emphasize importance. But if the Terracotta Army was real, if thousands of life-size warriors had actually been manufactured, then perhaps 700,000 workers wasn't an exaggeration at all. Perhaps it was a conservative estimate of what such a project would require. The text described how the workers dug down to the water table, then sealed the underground chambers with molten bronze to create a waterproof barrier. Geological surveys of Mount Li confirmed that the tomb was indeed located at a depth consistent with the water table, and that sophisticated drainage systems had been engineered to keep the chambers dry. Another detail verified, another legend made real. Sima Qian wrote that the tomb contained representations of palaces and official buildings, that it was designed as a complete capital city for the afterlife. The Terracotta Army, arranged in military formation, was positioned east of the tomb mound itself, suggesting they were guarding the approach to something larger. If the warriors were real, what about the palace? What about the towers and the courtyards and the chambers described in the ancient text? The mercury rivers posed the biggest challenge to credulity. How could liquid mercury, a toxic metal, have been maintained in a flowing state for 2,000 years underground? It seemed impossible, the kind of detail that confirmed these were myths, not memories. But when researchers tested the soil around and above the tomb mound, they found mercury concentrations hundreds of times higher than the surrounding area. Something was down there, sealed beneath earth and stone, something that had been preventing mercury from escaping into the environment for more than 2 millennia. The contradiction deepened. Every time archaeologists assumed the ancient texts were exaggerating, physical evidence suggested otherwise. Every time they treated descriptions as metaphorical, surveys indicated those descriptions might be literal. The tomb itself remained sealed. No one had opened it. No one had broken through whatever barriers protected the emperor's burial chamber, but the circumstantial evidence was mounting that what lay beneath Mount Li might be even more elaborate than what had been discovered in the pits containing the terracotta warriors. This created a philosophical problem for archaeology as a discipline. If the legends were true, if the ancient historians had accurately recorded what they heard or witnessed, then modern scholars had been wrong to dismiss those accounts. But if the legends were true, then archaeology had to confront the fact that truth sometimes exceeded imagination, that ancient civilizations had sometimes been capable of achievements that modern minds struggled to credit, that skepticism, necessary as it was, could blind researchers to possibilities that seemed too extraordinary to be real. The terracotta warriors stood as physical proof of this contradiction. They were simultaneously real and impossible, documented and unbelievable, verified and still somehow beyond full comprehension. Each warrior's face was different, which meant each had been individually sculpted. The logistics of this alone challenged understanding. How many artisans would be required? How much clay? How much time? How would you organize 700,000 workers to accomplish something like this while also building the tomb itself, the drainage systems, the access corridors, the other chambers described in the texts? And if all of this was real, if the warriors and the horses and the chariots and the bronze weapons were all exactly as described, then what about the other elements mentioned in Sima Qian's account? What about the crossbow traps allegedly still set to defend the tomb? What about the pearl-studded ceiling representing the night sky? What about the emperor himself, supposedly dressed in jade armor, lying in a bronze coffin, surrounded by everything he would need for an afterlife he had spent his entire reign trying to guarantee? The contradiction remained unresolved because the tomb remained unopened. Chinese authorities had decided that excavation technology wasn't advanced enough to risk disturbing whatever lay inside. Better to wait, better to preserve, better to leave the mystery intact than to damage something irreplaceable through premature investigation. So the legends and the reality existed in an uncertain space, each supporting and contradicting the other, each suggesting that truth was stranger and more complex than either history or mythology alone could capture. Why would someone build an army of clay soldiers? The question seemed simple, but answers multiplied the more scholars examined it. Every theory revealed different assumptions about death, power, belief, and the nature of human ambition in the ancient world. The most straightforward explanation was religious. Ancient Chinese belief systems included detailed conceptions of the afterlife, where the dead continued to exist in a realm that mirrored the living world but operated under different rules. If Qin Shi Huang believed he would continue to rule in death as he had in life, then he would need an army, not because battles awaited him beyond the grave, but because an emperor without military power was inconceivable. The terracotta warriors were tomb guardians, spiritual protectors created to serve the same function in the afterlife that living soldiers served in the mortal realm. This theory had historical support. Earlier Chinese tombs contained small figurines, mingxi, objects specifically made for burial, representing servants, animals, houses, everything the deceased might need in the world beyond death. The Terracotta Army could be understood as an extension of this tradition, scaled up to match the unprecedented power of the first emperor. Where a minor aristocrat might be buried with a dozen small clay figures, the man who unified China would naturally require thousands of life-sized warriors. But other scholars questioned whether religious belief fully explained what had been created. The level of detail in the warriors suggested a different purpose. These weren't generic soldiers, they were portraits, individuals, each with distinct facial features, different ages, varying expressions. If the goal was merely to provide the emperor with spiritual protection, why not mass-produce identical figures? Why invest the enormous additional labour required to make each warrior unique? This led to a second theory, that the Terracotta Army was fundamentally about power, not in the afterlife but in the present moment of its creation. Building something on this scale required organisation, resources, and centralised authority that only an emperor controlling all of China could marshal. The army was a demonstration, a way of showing the world and perhaps showing himself that no project was too ambitious, no expenditure too great, no vision too grand for the unified empire to achieve. The warriors served a political function, proving that Qin Shi Huang could command reality itself to conform to his will. A third interpretation focused on the emperor's documented obsession with immortality. Historical records showed that Qin Shi Huang spent years searching for the elixir of life, sending expeditions across the seas to find islands where immortals supposedly lived, consuming mercury compounds that his alchemists promised would make him immortal but which likely contributed to his death at age 49. A man this desperate to avoid death might have built the Terracotta Army not because he believed in an afterlife, but because he was terrified there might not be one. The warriors could be understood as insurance, a backup plan, a hedge against the possibility that death might be final and absolute. Some historians proposed that the army represented a substitution. In earlier Chinese dynasties, human sacrifice had been common, with servants, soldiers, and even family members killed and buried with important rulers so they could continue their service in the afterlife. By the time of the Qin Dynasty, this practice had become less acceptable, though not entirely abandoned. Creating clay soldiers instead of sacrificing living ones could be seen as a reform, a more civilized approach to the same underlying belief. The terracotta warriors were substitutes for real soldiers who would otherwise have been forced to follow their emperor into death. But this interpretation troubled other researchers, who pointed out that the tomb's construction had killed thousands of workers anyway. If the point was to avoid human sacrifice, why did the historical text report that craftsmen who knew the tomb's secrets were sealed inside when it was completed, and that the workers who built the outer chambers were killed to prevent them from revealing the location of hidden treasures? The clay soldiers might have replaced ritual sacrifice, but they hadn't eliminated the death toll. They had just redirected it toward labourers rather than warriors. A more cynical theory suggested the Terracotta Army was simply vanity, the ultimate expression of an ego so massive it couldn't conceive of a world, even an afterworld, that didn't revolve around its own importance. Qin Shi Huang had standardized currency, writing, measurements, and laws across China. He had connected defensive walls into a single great wall. He had built a road system spanning the empire. He had burned books that contradicted his worldview and executed scholars who questioned him. Creating an army to serve him eternally was consistent with this pattern, not necessarily because he believed it would work, but because the act of creating it confirmed his power to remake reality according to his preferences. Contemporary Chinese archaeologists often emphasized a different angle, the artistic and technological achievement. Regardless of motivation, the terracotta warriors represented a pinnacle of ceramic engineering and artistic sophistication. The kilns required to fire figures of this size, the techniques needed to prevent cracking and collapse during the firing process, the skill necessary to create realistic human faces, all of this pointed to an advanced understanding of materials and methods. Perhaps the project's true purpose was to push Chinese craftsmanship to new heights, to create something that would demonstrate the technical capabilities of Qin civilization to history. The debates continued because no single theory could account for all the evidence. The warriors were religious objects and political statements and artistic achievements and expressions of fear and demonstrations of power and substitutes for human sacrifice and products of vanity all at once. They existed at the intersection of multiple motivations, multiple meanings, multiple truths that weren't mutually exclusive but rather layered over each other like the strata of earth that had hidden them for 22 centuries. And beneath all the theories ran a deeper question that no historian could definitively answer. Did Qin Shi Huang believe the Terracotta Army would actually protect him in an afterlife? Did he think these clay soldiers would come to life beyond death? Or did he know, in some private corner of his mind, that this was theatre, that death would take him as it took everyone else, and that the warriors were simply the most elaborate grave marker ever constructed, a monument to a man who had conquered everything except the one enemy that conquered everyone? The excavation of the terracotta warriors was not like excavating a building, or even a traditional tomb. It was more akin to archaeological surgery. Each warrior emerging from the earth required patience, precision, and an understanding that one wrong move could destroy 2,000 years of preservation. The clay was fragile. The paint was more fragile still. And beneath the warriors lay a structural complexity that no one had anticipated. When archaeologists first began serious excavation of Pit 1 in 1975, they discovered that the warriors were not simply standing in open chambers. They had been housed in a complex underground structure with wooden beams supporting a timber roof, which had then been covered with woven mats and multiple layers of earth to create the appearance of natural ground. Over centuries, the wooden supports had rotted and collapsed, bringing the roof down on the warriors below, shattering many of them into fragments that lay buried in the rubble. This meant that excavation required not just digging but reconstruction. Each warrior that emerged in pieces had to be carefully documented, with every fragment photographed in situ before removal. Then came the painstaking work of reassembly, matching broken edges, identifying which arm belonged to which torso, which head fit which neck. Some warriors were relatively intact, requiring only cleaning and stabilization. Others existed as hundreds of terracotta shards that would take conservators months or even years to piece back together. The paint presented its own challenges. When the warriors were first created, they had been brilliantly coloured, reds and blues and greens and purples, with details picked out in contrasting shades to show rank, unit affiliation, and decorative patterns on armour and clothing. But the pigments were made from materials that reacted with air. Within minutes of exposure, the colours would begin to fade. Within hours, they would flake off, leaving bare terracotta behind. Early excavations lost much of the paint before anyone understood what was happening. By the time conservation scientists realised the problem, dozens of warriors had already been unearthed and their colours lost to oxidation. This forced a difficult decision, whether to continue excavation knowing that paint would be lost, or to stop and wait until preservation technology improved enough to save the colours. The choice was made to slow down dramatically, to excavate only small sections at a time, to experiment with preservation techniques on less important pieces before applying them to major discoveries. German conservation experts were brought in to help develop methods for stabilizing the paint. They created humidity-controlled environments where warriors could be excavated under conditions that minimized exposure to air. They developed chemical treatments that could bond the pigments to the clay beneath. But even with these improvements, much of the original colour was gone. What had once been a vibrant army now appeared mostly in shades of brown and grey, with only traces of its former brilliance visible in protected areas or in fragments that had been sealed away from air by the collapsed roof. As excavation progressed, the scale of the complex became clearer. Pit 1 contained an estimated 6,000 warriors arranged in a battle formation, infantry in the front ranks, chariots behind, with corridors between the columns allowing for movement and tactical flexibility. The warriors weren't randomly placed but positioned according to military principles, with officers identifiable by their distinct uniforms and postures, with different weapon types assigned to specific positions, with the entire formation oriented eastward as if marching toward a threat from that direction. Pit 2, discovered in 1976, revealed a different type of unit. This pit contained cavalry, with terracotta horses standing beside their riders, along with charioteers and what appeared to be an elite strike force of archers and infantry. The layout suggested this was a more specialized formation, perhaps representing a rapid response unit or a guard contingent distinct from the main army in Pit 1. Pit 3 was smaller, containing only 68 warriors, but its importance was immediately obvious. The figures here wore more elaborate armor and carried weapons of higher quality. Their positioning suggested a command structure, with the pit likely representing headquarters staff, the generals and strategists who would have directed the larger forces in the other pits. The presence of a chariot and evidence of ritual objects indicated this might also have served a ceremonial function. perhaps representing the emperor's personal guard or the commanders responsible for his protection. But the most significant discovery was what lay between the pits and the tomb mound itself. Ground-penetrating radar and systematic surveying revealed an entire buried complex, multiple chambers and corridors extending outward from the central burial site, suggesting that the terracotta warriors were only the outermost layer of a much larger funerary landscape. There were pits containing bronze chariots, incredibly detailed and perfectly preserved under the right conditions. There were chambers with terracotta acrobats and musicians, suggesting that the emperor's afterlife would include entertainment as well as military protection. There were areas containing the bones of actual horses and other animals, along with evidence of human remains that might have been servants or craftsmen killed and buried as part of the tomb's completion. Each new discovery required adjustment to the overall interpretation. This wasn't just a tomb with an army. It was an attempt to recreate the emperor's entire world in miniature, to ensure that death changed as little as possible about his circumstances, that he would wake in the afterlife surrounded by everything he had commanded in life. The investigation also revealed evidence of ancient looting and deliberate destruction. Some warriors showed signs of having been deliberately smashed in antiquity. Weapons had been removed from most figures, either by looters or possibly by rebels who had broken into parts of the complex after the Qin Dynasty fell. Historical texts mentioned that Xiang Yu, a rebel leader who helped overthrow the Qin, had burned the emperor's palace above ground and possibly violated parts of the tomb complex. The damage pattern suggested violent intrusion, but importantly the intrusion had been partial. The looters or vandals had never reached the main burial chamber, which remained sealed beneath Mount Li, still guarded by its army of clay soldiers, still waiting in the darkness for an emperor who would never return. The warriors themselves were evidence, but they were also gateways to understanding an entire civilization's capabilities, beliefs, and organizational structure. Every detail revealed something about the world that created them, and as archaeologists catalogued those details, a picture emerged of technical sophistication that challenged modern assumptions about what ancient societies could achieve. Start with the faces. No two are identical. This was the first thing that struck researchers as they examined warrior after warrior, the consistent individuality, the sense that these were not abstractions but portraits. Some faces are young, barely out of adolescence, smooth-cheeked and wide-eyed. Others show age, with furrowed brows and sagging jowls that suggest veterans, men who had survived decades of warfare. Some have moustaches, carefully sculpted with individual hairs visible in the clay. Others are clean-shaven. Some have Han Chinese features. Others show characteristics from the various ethnic groups that populated Qin territories, broad faces from the north, narrower features from the south. The level of anatomical accuracy is remarkable. The ears are correctly proportioned with proper curvature and detail. The hands, where they survive, show accurate bone structure and realistic positioning, fingers wrapped around weapons or hanging naturally at sides. The feet, protected inside the warrior's boots, include proper toes and realistic arches. Someone understood human anatomy well enough to sculpt it accurately at life-size scale, and that understanding was shared across hundreds or thousands of individual craftsmen who worked on different warriors yet maintained consistent quality. The hair provides another layer of information. Each warrior's hair is pulled back and arranged in a top knot, but the styles vary, some simple, others elaborate, some wound tightly, others looser. These variations likely indicated rank or unit affiliation, visual markers that would have been instantly readable to anyone familiar with Qin military organization. The detail extends to the ribbons and fastenings, small elements that serve no structural purpose, but which add to the realism and individuality of each figure. The armor is equally revealing. The warriors wear different types of protective gear depending on their role. Infantry soldiers have heavier armor, with overlapping plates covering chest and back. Archers wear lighter gear that allows for greater mobility. Officers have more decorative armor with additional elements suggesting higher status. The armor plates are individually rendered, each one visible as a separate piece, each one showing the rivets or ties that would have held actual armor together. This wasn't simplified or stylized, it was an accurate representation of real military equipment. The weapons were real. This surprised early researchers who expected ceremonial or symbolic items. Instead, the warriors had been equipped with actual bronze swords, crossbows, spears, and halberds. The weapons were functional, sharp, properly weighted and balanced. Chemical analysis showed they had been treated with chromium compounds, an anti-rust technology that wouldn't be rediscovered in the West until the 20th century. The swords, after more than 2,000 years underground, were still sharp enough to cut paper. Most of the weapons were stolen in antiquity, probably during the chaos that followed the dynasty's collapse, but enough remained to reconstruct the arsenal. The crossbows were particularly sophisticated, with bronze triggers that showed advanced mechanical understanding. The triggers operated on the same principles as modern firearms triggers, with multiple moving parts that had to be precisely fitted to function correctly. These weren't crude implements, but precision instruments that required significant engineering knowledge to manufacture. The bronze chariots discovered in separate pits near the warriors provided even more evidence of technical mastery. These chariots were half-size, replicas, incredibly detailed, with moving parts that still functioned after 2 millennia. The wheels turned on axles. The canopies could be raised and lowered. The horses, 4 to each chariot, wore harnesses with hundreds of individual bronze pieces, each one properly shaped and assembled. The reins were made of bronze wire, thin enough to be flexible but strong enough to function. The entire assemblage showed an understanding of metallurgy, mechanics, and artistic design that rivaled anything being produced in the Mediterranean world at the same time. The clay itself revealed information about production methods. Chemical analysis showed it came from local sources near Mount Lee, but it had been processed and refined, purified to remove impurities that might cause cracking during firing. Different clay mixtures were used for different parts of warriors' bodies, with coarser clay for the solid legs that bore weight, and finer clay for the hollow torsos and detailed faces. This showed sophisticated understanding of material properties and structural engineering. The firing process remained partially mysterious. Kilns large enough to fire life-size figures required careful temperature control, and firing had to be done slowly to prevent thermal shock that would shatter the clay. Yet somehow, ancient craftsmen had managed to fire thousands of warriors successfully, with a relatively low failure rate. The kilns themselves hadn't been found, but evidence suggested they might have been single-use structures, built specifically for each firing batch and then demolished. An expensive approach, but one that ensured optimal conditions. Maker's marks appeared on many warriors, small stamps or scratches hidden on the backs or bases, identifying which workshop or which individual craftsman had created that particular figure. These marks allowed researchers to identify different artistic hands, different studios, different production periods. Some workshops produced warriors with distinctly naturalistic faces, others tended towards slightly more stylized features. Some were clearly more skilled than others, but even the less accomplished work maintained a baseline of quality that suggested rigorous training and supervision. The evidence extended beyond the warriors themselves. The tomb complex included drainage systems engineered to prevent flooding, with channels directing groundwater away from critical areas. There were ventilation shafts designed to provide air circulation to underground chambers. There were access corridors sealed with specific types of clay that acted as waterproof barriers. Every element showed planning, showed an organizational structure capable of coordinating thousands of workers across decades, showed a civilization that understood logistics, materials science, and long-term preservation in ways that left physical evidence still visible 2,000 years later. And this was just what had been excavated. The sealed tomb mound still waited, still held secrets, still contained whatever lay at the center of this vast funerary landscape. The evidence from the periphery suggested that the core would be even more elaborate, even more revealing about the capabilities and beliefs of the civilization that built it. But that evidence remained locked away, preserved by the same engineering that had kept it intact for more than 2 millennia, waiting for a future when it could be safely revealed. The terracotta warriors were extraordinary, but they were never meant to be seen. This was the realization that slowly dawned on researchers as they understood the scope of what had been created and then deliberately hidden. Unlike monuments built to impress the living, unlike temples or palaces designed for public view, the underground army had been constructed specifically to be buried, to disappear, to exist only in the unseen realm beyond death. This raised uncomfortable questions. If the purpose was religious or spiritual, if the warriors were meant to serve the emperor in the afterlife, then why such attention to detail? Why give each warrior a unique face if no living eyes would ever see them again? Why equip them with real weapons if those weapons would never be used? Why build elaborate drainage systems if the chambers were meant to remain sealed forever? The answer suggested something unsettling about Qin Shi Huang's relationship with death and immortality. He didn't build the tomb complex because he accepted death. He built it because he refused to accept it. The warriors, the chariots, the acrobats, the musicians, the entire buried palace, all of it represented a kind of bargain with mortality. If he had to die, he would die as an emperor, with every luxury and protection he had commanded in life. But more than that, the tomb suggested he believed, or wanted to believe, or needed to believe, that death was not an ending but a transition, that consciousness would continue, that he would wake up in these chambers and find everything exactly as he had ordered it. The tomb mound itself held the deepest mysteries. It rose 50 meters above the surrounding plain, a man-made mountain, visible for miles, marking the location even as it concealed what lay beneath. According to Sima Qian's account, written a century after the tomb's completion, the burial chamber lay deep underground, dug down to the water table, then sealed with molten bronze to create an impervious barrier against moisture. Inside, the historian claimed, was a complete palace, with ceilings inlaid with pearls representing stars, with mechanical devices causing mercury to flow through channels representing the rivers of China, with eternal lamps fueled by whale oil designed to burn forever. Modern technology had confirmed some of these claims. Soil tests detected mercury concentrations indicating that liquid mercury was indeed present in significant quantities beneath the mound. Seismic surveys suggested the presence of large chambers and corridors. Ground-penetrating radar showed anomalies consistent with constructed spaces rather than solid earth. But the tomb itself remained unopened, deliberately, because Chinese authorities recognized that excavation technology was not yet advanced enough to preserve whatever lay inside. This created a strange situation where everyone knew something extraordinary existed but no one could access it. The tomb was like a book written in an unknown language, present and real but unreadable. Its contents a matter of inference and speculation rather than direct knowledge. And the longer it remained sealed, the more the mystery deepened, because every year brought new archaeological discoveries from other sites that revised understanding of what ancient civilizations could accomplish. The mercury rivers posed particular puzzles. If Sima Qian's account was accurate, if mercury had actually been engineered to flow through channels mechanically, then ancient Chinese craftsmen had created something that wouldn't be replicated until the Renaissance, a self-perpetuating mechanical system operating independently of human intervention. But how? What power source? What mechanism? Mercury is heavy, toxic, and difficult to work with even with modern equipment. The idea that ancient engineers had created a working hydraulic system using mercury seemed impossible, yet the elevated mercury readings suggested something was down there, something involving quantities of mercury far beyond what natural processes could explain. The crossbow traps mentioned in historical texts were another mystery. Sima Qian claimed the tomb was defended by automatically triggered crossbows that would fire at anyone who entered. Were these real? If so, would they still function after 2,000 years? The bronze crossbows found with the terracotta warriors showed that ancient craftsmen understood the mechanics of trigger mechanisms and stored energy. Creating a trap that could lie dormant for centuries and then activate was theoretically possible, though the practical challenges were immense. Yet if other apparently impossible claims about the tomb had proven true, why not this one? The question of what happened to the workers haunted the investigation. Historical texts stated that craftsmen who knew the tomb's secrets were sealed inside when construction was completed, ensuring their knowledge died with them. Other accounts mentioned that workers who had built the access corridors were killed after the emperor's burial, eliminating anyone who might reveal the location of hidden treasures. These weren't metaphors or legends. They were documented practices, and evidence of mass graves near the tomb complex suggested the accounts were accurate. This meant the terracotta warriors represented not just an artistic achievement, but a human cost that was difficult to calculate. How many people had died to create this underground empire? How many had laboured under threat of execution if they made mistakes? How many had been killed simply because they possessed knowledge that might threaten the tomb's security? The warriors stood as monuments not just to an emperor's ambition, but to the expendability of human life when power became absolute. The deeper mystery was psychological. What must it have been like to be Qin Shi Huang, powerful enough to command the creation of an underground palace, successful enough to unify China for the first time in history, yet terrified enough of death to devote decades and enormous resources to preparation for it? He sent expeditions across the seas searching for islands where immortals lived. He consumed mercury pills his alchemists promised would grant eternal life. He built a tomb meant to preserve him forever. Every action revealed someone trying desperately to control what couldn't be controlled, to defeat what couldn't be defeated, to extend life beyond the moment when biology inevitably failed. The Terracotta Warriors were the physical manifestation of that desperation. They were hope rendered in clay, fear transformed into art, mortality denied through meticulous planning. They were evidence that even the most powerful human being who ever lived in ancient China couldn't escape the fundamental truth that all power ends, all empires fall, all emperors die. But they were also evidence that knowing this truth didn't stop someone from trying to find a loophole, a way through, a method of persisting beyond the final breath. And they had persisted. Not the emperor. His body was somewhere beneath Mount Li, long since decayed despite whatever preservation techniques had been employed. But the warriors remained, standing guard over emptiness, protecting nothing, serving no one, yet somehow still fulfilling their purpose by existing, by waiting, by proving that something of the past could survive into the distant future even if consciousness could not. The turning point in Qin Shi Huang's relationship with mortality can be traced to a specific moment, though the historical records disagree on the exact details. It happened during the 3rd or 4th year after unification, when he was travelling through his newly consolidated empire, inspecting territories, accepting submission from former rival kingdoms, demonstrating that the era of warring states had ended and a new age of centralized control had begun. An assassin nearly killed him. The accounts vary. Some say it was a warrior hired by remnants of a defeated kingdom. Others claim it was a scholar opposed to the book burnings and intellectual repression. What matters is that someone got close enough to strike, close enough that the emperor felt the blade pass near his flesh, close enough that he understood in that moment how fragile his existence was, how dependent his power was on the continued functioning of his physical body, how quickly everything he had built could end if his heart stopped beating. Before this, death had been abstract, something that happened to other people, to soldiers in his armies, to rivals he defeated, to the common people whose lives and deaths were beneath his notice. But after the assassination attempt, death became personal. It wasn't a distant concept but an active threat, a shadow that followed him, a countdown he couldn't see but knew was running. He was in his late 30s, physically healthy, at the peak of his power, yet suddenly and completely aware that none of that mattered, that biology would fail him eventually regardless of how many kingdoms he conquered or how many walls he built. His response was methodical and desperate in equal measure. First, he increased security, surrounding himself with guards, limiting access, trusting no one. But physical security couldn't address the underlying problem. Death would come eventually regardless of how many warriors protected him. So he turned to other solutions, to philosophy, to religion, to alchemy, to any system of thought or practice that promised extension of life or continuation beyond death. He became obsessed with Taoist concepts of immortality. Taoism in the 3rd century BCE included strands of thought focused on physical immortality, achieved through meditation, special diets, breathing techniques, and alchemical preparations. There were stories of immortals living on distant islands, people who had achieved eternal life through secret methods they might share with someone powerful enough, worthy enough, desperate enough. Qin Shi Huang believed these stories or wanted to believe them, or simply couldn't afford not to believe them. He sent expeditions across the eastern seas, ships filled with young men and women, supplies, gifts, searching for the islands of the immortals. The most famous expedition was led by a man named Xu Fu, who claimed to know where the immortals lived but needed 3,000 young people and vast resources to make the journey. Qin Shi Huang provided everything requested. Xu Fu sailed east and never returned, probably settling somewhere on the Japanese archipelago or the Korean peninsula, far from the emperor's reach, living on the resources provided for a mission he never intended to complete. But the emperor couldn't know this. He waited for Xu Fu's return, waited for the elixir of immortality, waited for the secret that would free him from the terror of death. While waiting, he pursued other approaches. He consulted with alchemists who prepared mercury-based compounds supposed to grant immortality. Mercury was associated with transformation in Chinese alchemical thought. Liquid metal, neither fully solid nor fully liquid, existing in a state between forms. If mercury could transform, perhaps it could transform the human body into something permanent, something immune to decay. Modern understanding of mercury's toxicity makes clear what ancient alchemists didn't know. Consuming mercury destroys the body rather than preserving it. The tremors, the paranoia, the erratic behavior documented in Qin Shi Huang's later years were probably symptoms of mercury poisoning. The very substance he believed would grant immortality was killing him, accelerating the death he was trying to prevent. But he continued consuming it because the alternative, accepting mortality, was psychologically impossible. Simultaneously with these pursuits, he ordered construction of the tomb. This was the practical fallback, the acknowledgement that immortality might not be achievable, but preparation for death could be. If he couldn't avoid dying, he could at least ensure that death changed as little as possible about his circumstances. He would die as an emperor, surrounded by everything an emperor commanded: military protection, entertainment, servants, treasures, housed in a palace as elaborate as any he inhabited while living. The tomb's construction became a race against time. He was aging, the mercury was poisoning him, and despite all his expeditions and alchemical experiments, immortality remained elusive. The tomb needed to be ready before death arrived, needed to be complete enough to serve its purpose. 700,000 workers laboured continuously, the project consuming resources that might have been used to improve the empire, to build infrastructure, to benefit the living population. But those concerns were secondary to the emperor's primary goal: defeating or at least mitigating death. The Terracotta warriors were ordered during this period, not at the beginning of his reign, but after the assassination attempt had made death real to him. They represented a specific vision of afterlife protection, an army as detailed and capable as the living forces that had won him his empire. If he had to die, he would die defended, ready for whatever battles or threats existed beyond the threshold of mortality. This was the turning point, the moment when Qin Shi Huang's reign shifted from outward conquest to inward terror, from building an empire to building a defense against the inevitable. Everything that followed, the increasing paranoia, the brutal repression of dissent, the execution of anyone who hinted that immortality was impossible, the desperate consumption of mercury that hastened the death it was supposed to prevent, all of it stemmed from one moment when an assassin's blade came close enough to show the emperor that power was temporary and flesh was fragile, and all the kingdoms in the world couldn't change the fundamental conditions of human existence. The warrior stood as evidence of this transformation, life-sized and detailed and buried, created with meticulous care then hidden from view, representing not confidence in an afterlife, but desperate hope that death might not be the end, that consciousness might continue, that an emperor who couldn't defeat mortality in life might somehow defeat it in death through sufficient preparation and sufficient force of will. Qin Shi Huang died in 210 BCE while travelling through the eastern provinces of his empire. He was 49 years old, poisoned by the mercury he had consumed, believing it would make him immortal. The irony was profound but lost on him in his final moments. He died far from his capital, far from the tomb that had consumed decades of preparation, far from the terracotta warriors standing guard over chambers he would now never consciously occupy. His death was kept secret. This detail reveals everything about the empire's fragility. The Prime Minister Li Si and the chief eunuch Zhao Gao, travelling with the emperor's entourage, understood that announcing the death immediately would trigger succession crises, rebellions, and the potential collapse of the unified state that had existed for barely more than a decade. So they concealed the body, placed it in a sealed carriage, and continued the journey as if the emperor still lived, issuing orders in his name, maintaining the fiction of his presence. The deception required gruesome measures. The body began to decompose in the summer heat. To mask the smell, the conspirators ordered a cart of fish to travel with the imperial carriage, the stench of rotting fish covering the stench of the emperor's decay. They travelled for weeks like this, maintaining appearances, forging documents, preparing for a transition they could control rather than chaos they could not. When they finally returned to the capital, They announced that the emperor had died and had designated his youngest son Huai as heir, passing over the legitimate eldest son Fusu, who was away commanding armies on the northern frontier. This was a lie. Qin Shi Huang had likely intended Fusu to succeed him, but Huai was weak, manipulable, exactly the kind of emperor that Li Si and Zhao Gao could control from behind the throne. They forged documents ordering Fusu to commit suicide, which he dutifully did, and placed Huai on the throne as the second emperor. The tomb complex received its final occupant under these circumstances, not with the grand ceremony that might have been planned, but with hurried efficiency driven by conspiracy and fear. The emperor's body, already decomposing, was placed in the burial chamber. The entrance was sealed. The warriors already stood in their pits, arranged years before, waiting. The mechanical devices were activated if they existed. The mercury rivers began flowing, if that was real. And the tomb mound was closed, 700,000 workers having completed the most elaborate burial structure in Chinese history for a man who had believed until his final breath that he wouldn't need it. But death was only the beginning of consequences. The Qin Dynasty, which Qin Shi Huang had believed would last 10,000 generations, collapsed within 4 years of his death. The second emperor was incompetent, easily manipulated, more interested in pleasure than governance. The systems his father had built, efficient but brutal, began to break down. The laws that had unified China through fear became unbearable without a strong central authority enforcing them. Rebellions began in the provinces. The first major uprising started among conscript labourers forced to travel to frontier posts. According to law, arriving late meant execution. When a group of conscripts was delayed by rain and knew they would arrive late regardless of their efforts, their leaders Chen Sheng and Wu Guang reasoned that since they would die anyway for being late, they might as well die fighting for something meaningful. They raised a rebellion that spread rapidly across territories where people had been waiting for any sign that the Qin system could be challenged. Other rebellions followed. Former nobles from conquered kingdoms saw opportunity. Regional commanders declared independence. The empire fractured along the same lines it had been unified, dissolving back into competing kingdoms, armies, and warlords. The very forces that Qin Shi Huang had spent his reign suppressing re-emerged the moment central control weakened. The tomb complex was violated during this chaos. Xiang Yu, a rebel general who became one of the most powerful figures in the civil war that followed the Qin collapse, reportedly broke into parts of the outer complex, stealing treasures, burning structures, perhaps vandalizing the terracotta warriors out of hatred for everything the Qin represented. Historical accounts describe fires burning for 3 months at the tomb site, smoke rising from underground chambers as wooden supports and silk hangings were consumed. But significantly, the main burial chamber remained sealed. Either Xiang Yu never found it, or the defences were too formidable, or something about the tomb's reputation for traps and curses deterred him from penetrating too deeply. The emperor's body remained wherever it had been placed. The mercury rivers continued flowing if they existed. The innermost secrets stayed hidden even as the dynasty he founded collapsed, and his empire dissolved into renewed warfare. The terracotta warriors survived this period damaged but intact. The roof had collapsed, whether from fire or structural failure or deliberate destruction, shattering many figures and burying them under tons of earth and rubble. But they weren't entirely destroyed, weren't melted down for their bronze weapons or smashed into powder. They remained, broken but present, waiting in the darkness as dynasties rose and fell above them. The Han Dynasty eventually reunified China, establishing a system that would last for 4 centuries. The Han emperors deliberately positioned themselves as different from the Qin, ruling through Confucian principles of virtue and proper conduct, rather than legalist principles of law and punishment. They presented Qin Shi Huang as a cautionary tale, a tyrant whose cruelty and paranoia had destroyed his own legacy, whose obsession with immortality had blinded him to the conditions that would ensure his dynasty's survival. But the Han also benefited from everything the Qin had built. The standardized writing system remained. The road network was maintained and expanded. The Great Wall was reinforced. The administrative structures that allowed centralized control of a vast territory continued, refined but fundamentally similar to what Qin Shi Huang had established. His empire fell, but his systems endured, proving that some of his vision had been sound even if his methods had been unsustainable. The tomb became legendary during the Han period. Sima Qian, writing his historical records, included detailed descriptions of its construction based on accounts from people who had worked on it or heard stories from those who had. The tomb's reputation grew, becoming symbol and warning, evidence of one man's attempt to defeat death through preparation and power, evidence of the futility of that attempt when the dynasty collapsed before the tomb's creator had been buried more than a few years. For 2,000 years the tomb remained mostly undisturbed. Dynasties changed. Emperors rose and fell. China fragmented and reunified multiple times. But the hill near Xi'an, where Qin Shi Huang lay buried, remained, its surface farmed by peasants who had no idea what lay beneath their fields, its interior sealed and silent, its warriors standing guard in the darkness, protecting an empire that no longer existed, and an emperor who had learned too late that mortality couldn't be defeated by force of will, or depth of preparation, or multitude of clay soldiers arranged in perfect formation. The discovery of the Terracotta Warriors in 1974 didn't just reveal something about ancient China. It changed modern China's relationship with its own past, and it altered the world's understanding of what human civilizations had been capable of achieving in the ancient world. The impact rippled outward in ways that are still unfolding decades later. For China, the timing was significant. The Cultural Revolution had officially ended in 1976, just 2 years after the warriors' discovery. For a decade, China had been convulsed by political upheaval that deliberately targeted traditional culture, old customs, ancient artifacts, anything that represented the feudal past. Museums had been ransacked, historic sites had been damaged or destroyed, scholars had been persecuted. The official ideology held that China needed to break completely with its history in order to build a revolutionary future. The Terracotta Warriors arrived in this context as something that couldn't be ignored or dismissed. They were too impressive, too clearly the product of sophisticated civilization, too obviously the kind of achievement that commanded international respect. When photographs of the excavation began circulating globally, when foreign archaeologists expressed amazement at what had been found, when international media outlets ran stories about China's buried army, it became impossible to maintain that China's past was merely feudal oppression deserving only rejection. The warriors became symbols of cultural pride at a moment when China was beginning to reconsider its relationship with tradition. Here was proof that Chinese civilization had produced something magnificent, that ancient Chinese craftsmen had possessed technical skills rivaling anything created in the classical Mediterranean world, that China's heritage included achievements worth celebrating rather than destroying. The government, recognizing the political value of this discovery, invested heavily in the excavation, in preservation, in making the site accessible to visitors both domestic and international. A museum was constructed directly over Pit 1, allowing visitors to view the warriors in situ, still standing in their excavated positions, still arranged in military formation. The museum became one of China's most important tourist destinations, visited by millions of people annually, generating revenue, but more importantly generating a sense of connection to a past that was no longer dismissed as backward or feudal, but recognized as foundational to Chinese identity. Internationally, the warriors challenged Eurocentric narratives about ancient technological and artistic achievement. Western art history had long been dominated by Greek and Roman examples, with ancient Chinese art often dismissed as decorative rather than truly significant. The Terracotta Warriors forced a reconsideration. Here was naturalistic sculpture at life-size scale, created in the 3rd century BCE, contemporary with Hellenistic art but developed independently, following different aesthetic principles but achieving comparable sophistication. The warriors travelled internationally in exhibitions that drew unprecedented crowds. When they were displayed at the British Museum, at the Metropolitan Museum in New York, at museums across Europe and North America, people waited hours to see them. The exhibitions weren't just successful, they were cultural phenomena, introducing millions of people to ancient Chinese civilization in ways that academic scholarship never could. A person who might never read a book about Chinese history would stand before a terracotta warrior and understand immediately that this represented a civilization of remarkable capability. The impact extended into popular culture. The warriors appeared in films, in novels, in video games, becoming iconic images recognizable even to people with minimal knowledge of Chinese history. They represented ancient mystery, lost civilizations, the ambitious and sometimes terrible things human beings created when power and vision combined. They became shorthand for humanity's desire to defeat death, to leave permanent marks on history, to be remembered. For archaeology as a discipline, the discovery demonstrated the importance of careful, systematic excavation and the value of international cooperation in preservation techniques. The paint preservation challenges forced development of new conservation methods that were then applied to other sites. The scale of the excavation required organizational approaches that influenced how large archaeological projects were managed globally. The decision to leave parts of the site unexcavated, to preserve them for future generations with better technology, represented a shift in archaeological ethics toward long-term thinking rather than immediate discovery. The warriors also raised questions about cultural heritage and ownership. The Chinese government maintained strict control over the site and the artifacts. Warriors that travelled internationally for exhibitions were always loans, always temporary, always returned. This assertion of cultural sovereignty over ancient artifacts contrasted with European museums filled with objects acquired during colonial periods. The terracotta warriors became part of larger debates about who owns the past, who has the right to display it, whether cultural heritage should be repatriated or treated as universal human heritage accessible to all. Economically, the discovery transformed the region around Xi'an. What had been a relatively poor agricultural area became a major tourist destination. Hotels were built, infrastructure improved. Local residents found employment at the museum, as guides, in service industries supporting tourism. The warriors generated wealth, but not evenly distributed, creating tensions between those who benefited from tourism and those whose lives were disrupted by it. Educationally, the warriors entered curricula globally. Children in schools across the world learned about Qin Shi, about Chinese unification, about the Silk Road and ancient Chinese civilization. The warriors provided a concrete, visually compelling entry point into subjects that might otherwise seem abstract or distant. They made ancient history feel immediate and relevant, showing that people thousands of years ago had faced the same fundamental questions about mortality, legacy, and meaning that people still face today. The impact on understanding ancient Chinese military organization was significant. The warriors provided detailed evidence of armor types, weapon configurations, unit structures, and tactical formations that historical texts described but for which physical evidence had been limited. Military historians gained new insights into how ancient Chinese armies actually functioned, how soldiers were equipped, how units were organized, how the Qin had achieved military superiority that allowed them to unify China. But perhaps the deepest impact was philosophical. The warriors stood as monuments to human ambition and human futility simultaneously. They showed what could be achieved when resources, labour, and will converged, when a society organised itself completely toward accomplishing something unprecedented. But they also showed that all that achievement, all effort, all the power couldn't prevent the empire's collapse or the emperor's death or the eventual forgetting that time brings to everything. They were impressive and tragic in equal measure, beautiful and unsettling, inspiring and cautionary. They reminded the modern world that the past was not simply preparation for the present, that ancient people were not merely less developed versions of modern people, that civilizations rose and fell according to patterns that no amount of power could permanently override. They showed that human beings had always struggled with mortality, had always tried to leave marks that would outlast their brief lives, had always hoped that something, anything, might persist beyond the moment when breath stopped and consciousness ended. And they persisted. That was their ultimate impact. Against all odds, despite dynasty collapses and civil wars and centuries of burial and looters and fires and the slow decay of time, they remained. Not as the emperor had intended, not standing guard over a living ruler in an afterlife that never materialized, but as evidence that what humans create can sometimes survive longer than empires, longer than languages, longer than the memory of names, becoming part of a shared human heritage that transcends the specific moment and specific culture that brought them into existence. Behind every terracotta warrior stands a ghost, the artisan who shaped it, the labourer who hauled clay, the supervisor who checked proportions, the soldier who served as model, the engineer who designed kilns. These people had names, lives, hopes, fears, but history records, almost none of them. They were expendable in their time, and they remain anonymous in ours, known only through the work they left behind. Yet traces of their presence remain if you know where to look. The maker's marks stamped or scratched onto the backs and bases of warriors provide the closest thing we have to signatures. These marks identify workshops, individual craftsmen, supervisors responsible for quality control. They weren't added for posterity, they were quality assurance measures, ways of tracking who created what, so that mistakes could be traced back to their sources and punishment could be properly assigned. Some marks are simple characters indicating a workshop number or a production batch. Others are more elaborate, including names or titles. One warrior bears a mark that translates roughly as Palace Workshop 3, Master Craftsman Gong. That single mark is all we know of Gong, but it tells us he existed, that he was considered a master, that he worked in the third palace workshop, that his hands shaped the clay that became this specific warrior's face or torso or legs. Multiply that single mark by thousands of warriors, and you get a sense of the scale of human labour involved. This wasn't a small project run by a handful of master sculptors. This was an industrial operation, multiple workshops producing warriors, simultaneously each workshop employing dozens or hundreds of people, all working under centralised direction, all following standards that ensured consistency even across different production sites. The artisans who created the warriors were likely a mix of skilled craftsmen and conscripted labourers. Some would have been professional sculptors, people who had trained for years in ceramic arts, who understood clay properties and firing techniques, who could create realistic human faces and accurate anatomical proportions. Others would have been less skilled workers assigned to rougher tasks, making bricks, hauling materials, preparing clay, building kilns. Historical texts mention that the tomb's construction employed 700,000 workers at its peak. That number included everyone involved in the project, from engineers designing drainage systems to labourers digging trenches, to artists painting details on finished warriors. 700,000 people is not a small village, it's a major city, a temporary population that existed solely to build a tomb, that consumed vast resources, that required organisation and logistics comparable to maintaining an army in the field. These workers didn't volunteer. Some may have been skilled craftsmen hired at wages high enough to attract talent, but the majority were almost certainly conscripts, people forced into labour as a form of taxation or punishment, people who had no choice about participating, who worked under threat of punishment for mistakes or slowness, who understood that this project was not optional and their individual welfare was subordinate to its completion. The working conditions must have been harsh. Clay work is physically demanding. Firing kilns in the pre-industrial era meant working in intense heat, breathing smoke and fumes, risking burns from molten materials. The repetitive nature of producing thousands of similar objects would have been mentally exhausting. And all of this occurred under a system where failure, incompetence, or perceived disloyalty could result in execution. Yet despite these conditions, the quality remained high. This suggests that the workers, whatever their circumstances, took pride in their craftsmanship, or at least understood that producing inferior work would have dire consequences. Each warrior, even those created under duress, received careful attention. The faces were individually sculpted, not mass-produced. The details were rendered accurately. The firing was done carefully to minimize failures. This was not careless work by resentful slaves, but skilled work by people who understood their craft even if they had no choice about practicing it. Some workers left messages, not many, and always discreetly, because marking imperial property with anything other than approved stamps could mean death. But occasionally, in hidden spots on the backs of warriors or on bricks used in construction, archaeologists have found scratches that appear to be names or simple statements. One brick reportedly contained the scratched characters for "I was here," a desperate assertion of individual existence by someone who knew their name, would not appear in any official record, who would not be remembered or honoured, who would likely die unknown but who wanted to leave some trace, however small, that they had lived. The models for the warriors were almost certainly real soldiers. The uniforms, the weapons, the postures, all reflect actual military practice in the Qin army. This means soldiers from the emperor's forces, men who had fought in the wars of unification, stood while artists studied their faces, their builds, their bearing, translating living flesh into clay. Did they understand they were being immortalized? Did they feel honored to be chosen as models? Or did they simply obey orders, standing still while artists worked, unaware that their features would survive 2,000 years after their own bodies had returned to dust? The children who worked on the tomb are the most invisible of all. Historical texts don't mention them specifically, but large construction projects in ancient China regularly employed children for tasks that didn't require adult strength. They would have hauled water, carried tools, cleaned work areas, performed support functions that freed adults for more skilled labour. Some might have been apprentices, learning ceramic arts from masters, beginning careers that would last their entire lives. Others were simply additional labourers, children of conscripted workers who had no choice but to bring their families to the construction site because there was no one to care for them elsewhere. When the tomb was completed and sealed, historical accounts state that workers who knew its secrets were killed or sealed inside to ensure silence. This means that many of the people who created the terracotta warriors, who spent years or decades working on the project, who had shaped the clay and fired the kilns and painted the details, did not live to see old age. They were eliminated because the knowledge they possessed threatened the tomb's security. Their reward for creating one of history's most remarkable artistic achievements was death. Yet their work survived them. The warriors they created continued standing in the darkness long after the hands that shaped them had turned to dust. The precision they achieved, the skill they demonstrated, the individual character they gave to each face, all of this persisted, becoming their unintended legacy, the only testimony to their existence that history would preserve. They remain anonymous, but they are not forgotten, because every warrior embodies their skill, their labour, their brief lives spent creating something that would outlast empires. Qin Shi Huang's unification of China was not universally welcomed. For every person who benefited from standardized currency and unified laws, there were others who lost power, identity, or freedom. The resistance to his rule took many forms, from open rebellion to quiet subversion, from philosophical opposition to desperate acts of violence. Understanding this resistance helps explain why the emperor felt he needed an eternal army, why his paranoia deepened, why his tomb became a fortress. The most obvious opposition came from the old aristocratic families of conquered kingdoms. These were people who had ruled their own territories, commanded their own armies, enjoyed autonomy that evaporated when Qin armies arrived. After unification, Qin Shi Huang forced these families to relocate to the capital, where they could be monitored, stripping them of local power bases while maintaining the fiction that they retained status and respect. Many complied outwardly, while resenting inwardly, waiting for opportunities to reclaim what had been taken. The intelligentsia provided different resistance. Confucian scholars opposed the emperor's legalist philosophy, which valued law and punishment over virtue and moral example. These scholars believed proper governance came through education and ethical conduct, not through harsh laws and constant surveillance. They taught students to question authority when authority contradicted virtue, to value tradition over innovation, to preserve old texts over implementing new systems. This made them threats to an emperor who demanded absolute obedience and was implementing radical changes to every aspect of Chinese society. The book burning of 213 BCE was the emperor's response to this intellectual resistance. He ordered destruction of most books except those dealing with practical subjects like medicine, agriculture, and divination. Historical texts, philosophical treatises, poetry collections, anything that might encourage critical thinking or reference older, different ways of organizing society was to be burned. The intent was to create a population with no memory of alternatives, no framework for imagining governance different from Qin Shi Huang's system. But books weren't the only targets. The following year, 460 scholars were reportedly buried alive for possessing forbidden texts or teaching prohibited ideas. Whether the number is accurate or exaggerated, the message was clear. Intellectual resistance would be met with lethal force. Thinking differently from the emperor was not merely discouraged, it was a capital offence. The emperor's fear of death extended to fear of ideas that might outlive him, that might inspire resistance to his legacy after he was gone. Regional resistance simmered constantly. The empire had been unified militarily, but regional identities remained strong. People in the former state of Chu still considered themselves Chu people, maintained Chu customs, spoke Chu dialects. The same was true for other conquered kingdoms. Qin standardization policies, forcing everyone to use the same script, the same measurements, the same currency, were experienced as cultural erasure by populations that had distinct identities going back centuries. This cultural resistance was harder to suppress than military opposition because it operated in private, in homes and family gatherings, in the persistence of local traditions that official policy couldn't completely eliminate. People might use official currency in public transactions but revert to old systems among themselves. They might write in standardized script for government documents but maintain knowledge of older scripts in secret. They preserved songs, stories, customs that contradicted the official narrative of Qin superiority and necessity. The Great Wall construction generated its own resistance. Hundreds of thousands of workers were conscripted to extend and connect defensive walls in the north. Working conditions were brutal. Many died from exhaustion, exposure, accidents, disease. Families lost sons and fathers to a project that benefited the empire abstractly, but harmed them personally and immediately. Resentment built in regions that lost significant percentages of their adult male population to wall construction. Resentment that would explode into rebellion once central authority weakened. Common people resisted in quieter ways. Tax evasion was constant. Farmers hiding portions of harvests, merchants underreporting income, whole villages cooperating to present false accounts to tax collectors. The Qin legal code was comprehensive and harsh, but it depended on enforcement, and enforcement required cooperative populations. When populations instead cooperated to circumvent laws, the system's theoretical completeness became a practical liability, because every violation that went unpunished demonstrated that the emperor's authority had limits. The most direct resistance came from assassination attempts. Multiple plots are recorded, though sources disagree on exact numbers. The most famous involved Jing Kai, a warrior sent by the Crown Prince of Xi'an to kill the emperor before unification was complete. Jing Kai gained audience by presenting gifts, including a map that concealed a poisoned dagger. When he unfurled the map and seized the weapon, the emperor fled, unable to draw his own sword because court protocol required long ceremonial swords that were impractical weapons. Jing Kai chased him around pillars in the throne room before other officials could intervene. The assassination failed, but it succeeded in showing the emperor how vulnerable he was, how close death could come despite all his guards and precautions. This attempt and others like it shaped the emperor's psychology. He became increasingly paranoid, sleeping in different rooms each night, limiting who could approach him, trusting fewer and fewer people. The assassination attempts validated his worst fears, confirmed that enemies were everywhere, proved that vigilance could never be relaxed. If people wanted him dead while he lived, they would certainly desecrate his tomb after he died, hence the traps, the secrecy about the tomb's exact interior layout, the execution of workers who knew too much, the army of clay soldiers standing guard against threats he couldn't specifically name but deeply feared. Resistance also took religious and mystical forms. Prophecies circulated predicting the Qin Dynasty's fall. Omens were reported, strange lights in the sky, unusual animal behavior, meteorites falling near the capital. Whether these were genuine observations or deliberate fabrications by people hoping to undermine the emperor's authority, they created an atmosphere of cosmic opposition, suggesting that heaven itself opposed the Qin system. In a culture where the mandate of heaven was the fundamental legitimization of political power, such omens were serious threats. The emperor responded to prophecies by trying to control information. He banned discussion of portents, punished people who spread rumors, ordered investigations to identify sources of dissenting predictions. But information flowed anyway, through travelers, through merchants, through networks that connected people across regions despite the government's attempts to monitor and control all communication. The resistance never coalesced into unified opposition during the emperor's lifetime. It remained fractured, regional, consisting of separate groups with different grievances and different goals. But it was persistent, demonstrating that unification of China had been military and administrative but not cultural or emotional. That force could create an empire but couldn't create genuine loyalty. That people would comply outwardly while resisting inwardly, waiting for the moment when central authority weakened enough that open rebellion became possible. That moment came within years of the emperor's death, proving that his fear had been justified even if his methods of addressing it had been insufficient. The empire he built collapsed quickly once he was gone, brought down by the accumulated resentment of everyone who had been forced to conform, forced to labour, forced to abandon their identities and traditions for a system that served the emperor's vision, but not necessarily their welfare. The Terracotta warriors, created to protect him in death, couldn't protect the empire he had built in life, couldn't prevent the resistance from finally succeeding once the force holding everything together was buried beneath Mount Lee. The rediscovery of the Terracotta Warriors in 1974 coincided with China's gradual emergence from decades of political turmoil and cultural suppression. What followed was not just archaeological excavation, but a broader cultural awakening, a reassessment of what China's past meant for its present and future, a reclamation of heritage that had been dismissed, attacked, or forgotten during years when looking backward was considered ideologically suspect. The Cultural Revolution had systematically targeted what it called the Four Olds: old customs, old culture, old habits, old ideas. Museums were ransacked, temple statues were smashed, historic buildings were demolished or defaced. Scholars who specialized in traditional subjects were sent to labor camps for re-education. The operating assumption was that China's past represented feudal oppression, that traditional culture was an obstacle to revolutionary progress, that the only way forward required complete break with everything that had come before. But by the mid-1970s, this ideology was exhausted. The Cultural Revolution's excesses had damaged the country economically and socially. People were weary of constant political campaigns, endless struggle sessions, the atmosphere of suspicion and denunciation that had poisoned relationships and destroyed careers, based on ideological accusations rather than actual wrongdoing. When Mao Zedong died in 1976, the possibility opened for reconsideration, for asking whether rejecting all tradition had been necessary or wise, for wondering what had been lost in the rush to create a revolutionary future disconnected from any past. The Terracotta Warriors arrived in this moment as something undeniable. They couldn't be dismissed as feudal remnants deserving destruction, because they were already world famous, already attracting international attention, already generating pride among Chinese citizens who had been starved of reasons to feel proud of their heritage. The warriors were impressive in ways that transcended ideology, beautiful in ways that didn't depend on political interpretation, significant in ways that even revolutionary doctrine couldn't diminish. The government recognized this and made a strategic decision to embrace the discovery, rather than downplay it. Resources were allocated for excavation and preservation. International experts were invited to help with conservation. Plans were made for a museum that would showcase the warriors not as embarrassing evidence of feudal extravagance, but as testament to Chinese civilization's historic achievements. The shift was subtle but profound, from viewing the past as something to overcome to viewing it as something that could be selectively celebrated. This opened space for broader cultural revival. If terracotta warriors could be celebrated, what else from China's past deserved reconsideration? Traditional arts that had been suppressed began to re-emerge. Opera performances resumed. Classical literature was republished. Temples that had survived the Cultural Revolution started receiving restoration funding. Museums began displaying ancient artifacts again, not with apologetic commentary about feudal oppression, but with straightforward appreciation for craftsmanship and historical significance. The warriors specifically sparked interest in ancient Chinese art and archaeology among younger generations who had grown up learning that old things were bad things, that progress meant rejection of tradition. Seeing the warriors, whether in person at Xi'an or in photographs circulating nationally, challenged that narrative. These were clearly products of sophisticated civilization, created by people with advanced technical skills and artistic sensibilities. They represented achievement, not oppression. They were evidence that China's ancestors had built remarkable things, that history was more complex than ideological frameworks allowed. Educational curricula began to change. History classes that had focused narrowly on class struggle and revolutionary movements expanded to include broader cultural history. Students learned about the Qin Dynasty not only as a feudal system, deserving overthrow, but as a complex period when China was first unified, when standardization created foundations for future development, when art and engineering reached new levels of sophistication. The warriors became teaching tools, entry points into discussions about ancient society, technology, belief systems, the relationship between power and culture. Artists found inspiration in the warriors' combination of uniformity and individuality. Each warrior was unique, yet part of a collective, simultaneously individual and subordinate to larger formation. This resonated with artists exploring questions about personal identity within collective society. about how to maintain distinctiveness while functioning as part of larger social structures. Painters, sculptors, filmmakers, and writers created works referencing or inspired by the Terracotta Army, using it as metaphor for themes about conformity, resistance, memory, and mortality. The tourism industry that developed around the warriors brought economic benefits, but also created new relationships between local populations and their heritage. Farmers whose families had worked the land above the tomb for generations suddenly found themselves living at the center of international attention. Some benefited economically through employment at the museum or in supporting businesses. Others were displaced as the site expanded and buffer zones were created. This generated complex feelings about the discovery, pride in the heritage mixed with resentment about disruption, appreciation for economic opportunity tempered by loss of agricultural land. International exhibitions of the warriors in the 1980s and 90s further elevated China's cultural status globally. When warriors travelled to museums in Europe, North America, and eventually worldwide, they drew massive crowds and extensive media coverage. These exhibitions weren't just about showing ancient artifacts, they were soft power demonstrations, ways of showing that China possessed cultural heritage commanding international respect, that Chinese civilization had produced world-class achievements deserving serious attention. The warriors became ambassadors in ways their creator never intended. Qin Shi built them for the afterlife, for his private use to be hidden forever. Instead, they became public, famous, celebrated, representing not one man's fear of death but an entire civilization's capabilities. They transcended their original purpose, becoming symbols with meanings their builders never imagined, serving causes their emperor never envisioned. This transformation was itself a kind of awakening, recognition that heritage isn't fixed, that meaning changes across time, that what was created for one purpose can serve others, that the past is continually reinterpreted by present needs and future aspirations. The warriors meant something different to 20th century Chinese citizens rebuilding relationship with tradition than they meant to 3rd century BCE workers creating them. Neither meaning was more authentic than the other. Both were real, both were valid responses to the same physical objects separated by 2 millennia of history. The cultural renaissance the warriors helped catalyze wasn't return to the past, but rather integration of past with present, acknowledgement that modern identity could include traditional elements without being limited by them, that progress didn't require complete rejection of what came before. This was new thinking in China, or rather old thinking reclaimed after decades when it had been forbidden, and it shaped the country's development in subsequent decades as economic reforms created space for cultural expression and personal aspiration within political constraints. Young Chinese artists, writers, and filmmakers who grew up after the warriors' discovery had different relationships with heritage than their parents' generation. They could claim traditional culture as part of their identity without apologizing for it, could reference classical themes without being accused of feudal thinking, could explore China's long history without political risk. The warriors stood as proof that this heritage was worth exploring, that the past contained beauty and achievement alongside oppression and suffering, that complexity was more accurate than simplistic revolutionary narratives. The awakening wasn't uniform or complete. Tensions remained between tradition and modernity, between preserving heritage and pursuing development, between celebrating past achievements and acknowledging past injustices. The Qin Dynasty's legacy was complicated. Unification brought benefits but at terrible cost. Standardization enabled progress but destroyed diversity. Centralized power achieved stability, but through brutal repression. These complications didn't disappear just because terracotta warriors were beautiful, but the warriors made space for nuanced conversation. They were simultaneously magnificent and troubling, products of sophisticated civilization and brutal labor conditions, artistic achievements and monuments to imperial ego. They could be admired and questioned at the same time, celebrated and critiqued, used as sources of pride and as prompts for reflection about power's costs. This complexity was itself valuable, showing that heritage doesn't have to be simple to matter, that acknowledging dark aspects doesn't negate genuine achievements, that history can be faced honestly rather than sanitized into propaganda or dismissed as irrelevant. The cultural renaissance the warriors helped spark continued evolving in directions their discovery couldn't have predicted. They became part of global heritage, symbols recognized worldwide, contributing to conversations about human creativity, mortality, legacy, the relationship between individual artistry and collective labor. They showed that the past, properly engaged, wasn't dead weight holding back progress, but resource for understanding present challenges, foundation for building futures that acknowledged where they came from without being imprisoned by it. The deepest truth the Terracotta Warriors reveal is not about ancient China specifically, but about human nature universally. Strip away the cultural specifics, the Chinese context, the Qin Dynasty's particular circumstances, and what remains is something more fundamental, a confrontation with mortality that resonates across time and geography because it addresses the one absolutely universal human experience. Everyone dies. This simple fact generates more human behavior than almost any other. People create art hoping it will outlast them. They have children hoping to continue their genetic line. They build monuments hoping to be remembered. They accumulate wealth hoping to secure their families' futures. They pursue fame hoping their names will persist. They seek religious salvation hoping consciousness continues beyond biological death. All of this, every strategy humans have ever devised for dealing with mortality, stems from the same source, the knowledge that individual existence is temporary and the desperate hope that something, anything, might persist. Qin Shi Huang's response was more elaborate than most, but not fundamentally different in kind. He wanted to be remembered, wanted to maintain power beyond death, wanted to ensure that dying changed as little as possible about his circumstances. The scale was extraordinary, but the impulse was ordinary. Every person who has ever lived has grappled with the same question: what happens when I die? And every person who has had sufficient resources has tried to shape the answer through preparation, through belief, through creating something that will outlast individual mortality. The warriors embody this attempt in physical form. They are hope rendered tangible, fear transformed into action, mortality confronted through meticulous planning and enormous expenditure of labor and resources. They represent the human tendency to believe that sufficiently thorough preparation can control outcomes that are fundamentally beyond control. That if we just plan carefully enough, build elaborately enough, try hard enough, we can overcome limitations that apply to everyone else. This is the psychological mechanism underlying most human achievement. The pyramids, the cathedrals, the great libraries, the monuments that dot human history, all were built by people who knew they would die, but hoped their work would persist. The work became a way of defeating death indirectly, accepting that the body would fail, but believing that what the body created might endure. This is not delusion, it's strategy, a rational response to an inescapable problem. But the warriors also reveal the futility built into this strategy. They were created to serve the emperor in the afterlife, but there is no evidence that any afterlife exists. They were hidden to remain secret, but they were discovered. They were built to last forever, but they deteriorated, broke, required constant conservation to prevent further decay. They were meant to protect, but they protected nothing except themselves, becoming artifacts rather than guardians, objects of study rather than functional army. Everything about their original purpose failed, yet somehow they succeeded differently than intended, becoming sources of wonder, prompts for reflection, evidence of human capability and limitation simultaneously. This contradiction is the core truth. Human efforts to transcend mortality both work and don't work. They work because things do persist. The warriors still exist, art survives artists, buildings outlast builders, ideas propagate beyond thinkers' lifetimes. But they don't work because the persistence isn't what was intended. The warriors don't serve Qin Shi Huang in any afterlife. They serve researchers, tourists, anyone who looks at them and thinks about mortality, legacy, the relationship between ambition and futility. They've been repurposed by history, their meaning changed by time, their existence continuing in ways their creator never imagined and probably wouldn't have valued. The revelation extends to understanding power's relationship with mortality. Qin Shi Huang had absolute power over millions of people, could command any resource, could order any project, could have anyone killed who displeased him. Yet all that power couldn't prevent his death, couldn't actually ensure his consciousness would continue, couldn't control how his legacy would be interpreted by future generations. Power is temporary, constrained by the lifespan of whoever holds it, and no amount of power changes the fundamental fact that biology eventually fails, and consciousness, as far as anyone can demonstrate, ends with it. This suggests something about the nature of power itself. Perhaps part of power's appeal is precisely that it offers the illusion of transcending normal limitations. Powerful people can ignore rules that constrain others, can act as if consequences don't apply to them, can accumulate resources far beyond what any individual could use in a lifetime. This creates psychological distance from ordinary mortality, a sense of being exceptional, of existing outside the constraints that govern common experience. But it's illusion, comforting perhaps, but ultimately false. The most powerful person dies just as certainly as the least powerful, and all the clay soldiers in all the underground chambers in the world don't change that. The warriors also reveal truth about collective versus individual legacy. Every warrior represents individual labor, someone's hands shaping that specific face, but the workers are anonymous while the emperor is remembered. The workers created the achievement but received none of the credit. Their skill, their effort, their lives were consumed by a project that memorialized someone else, someone who designed nothing, sculpted nothing, fired no kilns, painted no details, but who commanded it all and whose name alone is associated with the result. This is how history generally functions. Individual workers remain anonymous while leaders are remembered. Collective effort is credited to individual commanders. The many who actually accomplish things are forgotten, while the few who ordered things are immortalized. The Terracotta Warriors make this visible because we can see the individual variation in faces, can recognize that each represents specific person's work, can acknowledge the anonymous artisans even though we can't name them. But typically this recognition doesn't happen. History records kings and emperors, generals and politicians, people with power to command projects, while the workers who actually executed them disappear from memory. Yet the worker's legacy persists in the work itself. Every warrior embodies someone's skill, someone's attention to detail, someone's decision to do good work even under duress. The anonymous artisans succeeded in creating something that survived them, even if they received no credit, even if they were probably killed after the tomb's completion, even if everything about their individual lives is lost except what their hands shaped in clay. This is its own kind of immortality, imperfect and anonymous but real, showing that legacy doesn't require name recognition, that impact can persist without attribution. The deepest revelation might be about meaning itself. The warriors were created with specific purpose, specific meaning defined by their creator and the culture that produced them. That meaning was religious, military, political, personal, all layered together in Qin Shi Huang's conception of what his afterlife would require. But that meaning is gone, irrelevant, replaced by meanings we assign in the present, meanings about art, about history, about humanity's relationship with mortality, about what ancient civilizations could achieve, and what they reveal about persistent human concerns. This shows that meaning isn't fixed, isn't determined solely by creators' intentions, but evolves as circumstances change, as new people encounter old objects, as history accumulates layers of interpretation over original purposes. The warriors mean something different now than they did to the people who created them, and they'll mean something different again to future generations with their own concerns and questions. This mutability of meaning is itself meaningful, showing that the past remains alive not because it's unchanging, but because each present reinterprets it, finds new relevance, discovers new questions to ask of old evidence. The Terracotta Warriors finally reveal that humans have always been exactly as they are now, concerned with the same fundamental issues, employing the same psychological strategies for coping with mortality, creating elaborate systems for making temporary existence feel more permanent or meaningful. The specific expressions change, cultural contexts vary, technological capabilities advance, but the underlying concerns remain constant. We are not fundamentally different from the people who created these warriors, not smarter or wiser or more enlightened. We face the same unknowns, the same certainty of death, the same desire to matter, to persist, to leave something behind that outlasts our brief time breathing and thinking and trying to understand what any of this means. Stand at the edge of Pit 1, look down at the rows of warriors emerging from Earth that held them for 22 centuries, and ask yourself what you see. The official answer is obvious: archaeological treasure, artistic achievement, historical evidence. But the personal answer, the one that rises unbidden when you stand in that specific space confronting that specific sight, might be something else entirely, something about your own mortality, your own insignificance, your own desperate hope that you matter, despite all evidence suggesting individual human lives are brief interruptions in geologic time that will forget you completely within generations of your death. The warriors forced this reflection because they make time visible. They were buried when the Roman Republic was young, when the Great Wall of China was being constructed, when most of human history still lay ahead. They waited in darkness through the rise and fall of dynasties, through inventions and plagues and wars and peaceful centuries, through everything that humans did and suffered and created while the warriors stood frozen underground, unchanged, patient, holding their positions in formations that no enemy would ever attack because the enemy, time itself, had already won before the first warrior was fired in its kiln. This visibility of deep time creates perspective that ordinary life rarely provides. Most days we operate in personal time, measured by appointments and deadlines, birthdays and anniversaries, the rhythms of individual and family life. Occasionally we think in historical time, connecting present to past through stories and documents, understanding that we're part of longer sequences than our own experience. But geological time, the scale on which civilizations rise and fall, on which empires become archaeological sites, on which everything humans build eventually crumbles and disappears, this time is too vast to comfortably contemplate, too overwhelming to hold in consciousness for long. The warriors make it impossible to avoid. They were created by people who are as dead as anyone can be, whose names are forgotten, whose descendants are untraceable, whose civilization collapsed so long ago that it feels not quite real, more like story than history, despite all the physical evidence proving it happened. Yet here are objects those people made, solid and present, occupying space, demanding acknowledgement. The gap between creation and rediscovery is so vast it's almost meaningless, yet also so immediate, because the warriors are right there, actual physical things connecting distant past to immediate present. This creates the unsettling recognition that we occupy the same relationship to future as those ancient artisans occupy to us. We're creating things that will outlast us, not deliberately like the warriors, but incidentally through everything we build, write, record, establish. Future people will excavate our time the way we excavate theirs. We'll find our objects strange or familiar. We'll wonder about our lives, our beliefs, our concerns. They will probably misunderstand much, will impose their own frameworks on our evidence, will tell stories about us that we wouldn't recognize. But they will know we existed, will have proof we were real, will study our remnants trying to understand what we were thinking, and whether we knew what we were doing, and whether we understood the consequences of our choices. The warriors suggest our preparations for the future are probably as misguided as Qin Dynasty preparations for the afterlife. We think we're building for specific purposes, solving specific problems, creating specific legacies. But the future will repurpose everything. We'll find uses we never imagined. We'll preserve what we considered disposable and discard what we thought important. We'll judge us by standards we can't anticipate, because they'll emerge from circumstances we can't predict. This doesn't mean preparation is futile, but it does mean control is limited, that we can't actually determine how we'll be remembered, or whether we'll be remembered at all. There's something liberating in this recognition. If we can't control legacy, if memory is unreliable and meaning mutable, and posterity's judgment unknowable, then perhaps the point isn't to build monuments, or achieve fame, or create lasting impact. Perhaps the point is simpler, to live fully in the present, to do work we find meaningful regardless of whether it persists, to create and love and think not because these activities will outlast us, but because they constitute what it means to be alive, to be conscious, to be briefly here. The warriors embody the opposite approach, preparation for imagined future at the expense of actual present, resources diverted to tomb construction that could have improved living conditions, workers killed to maintain secrecy about a project that would be discovered anyway, an entire life shaped by fear of death rather than engagement with life. Qin Shi conquered China but couldn't enjoy his achievement because he was too terrified of losing it. He unified an empire but couldn't trust anyone within it. He built elaborate defenses against death but died anyway, probably hastened by the mercury he consumed hoping it would make him immortal. This is cautionary rather than inspirational. It shows that obsession with legacy can poison actual existence, that trying too hard to matter can prevent actually mattering to anyone, that fear of being forgotten can make you forget to live. The warriors were created by someone who never figured out that the question isn't how to avoid death or ensure remembrance, but how to live in ways that make death and eventual forgetting acceptable, bearable, maybe even natural conclusions to existence that was worthwhile regardless of what comes after or who remembers. Yet there's empathy in contemplating Qin Shi Huang's terror, his desperate attempts to control the uncontrollable, his belief that sufficient power and preparation could overcome biological inevitability. Who hasn't felt some version of this? Who hasn't tried to control outcomes beyond their control, to prepare for unknowable futures, to build defenses against threats that arrive anyway despite all precautions? The scale differs, but the impulse is recognizable, the very human tendency to believe that trying harder, planning better, accumulating more resources or knowledge or power will somehow exempt us from limits that apply to everyone else. The warriors remind us gently that this doesn't work, that we're not exceptional no matter what we achieve, that mortality comes for emperors and farmers equally, that all the clay soldiers and all the preparation and all the power in all the world don't change fundamental conditions of existence. But they also remind us that this is fine, that accepting limitation doesn't mean accepting insignificance, that brief existence can be meaningful even if it doesn't last forever, that we can create and love and think and work, knowing that it's temporary, that perhaps temporary is what makes it precious rather than what makes it pointless. Stand in front of a terracotta warrior, look at its face sculpted 22 centuries ago by hands long since dust, and you're confronting your own mortality, your own insignificance, your own brief moment of consciousness in vast time that preceded you and will continue after you. But you're also confronting something else, connection across impossible distance, recognition of shared humanity with people separated by millennia, acknowledgement that what we make and do and think matters to someone even if we never know who or when or how. The warrior can't speak, can't confirm or deny any interpretation, can only stand there being itself, clay-shaped and fired and painted and buried and rediscovered, meaning whatever we decide it means, serving whatever purpose we assign even though its original purpose is long obsolete. And maybe that's the final reflection the warriors offer, that meaning isn't found but created, that significance isn't inherent but assigned, that we decide what matters by choosing what to care about, what to preserve, what to remember, what to pass forward to future that will do the same, creating chains of meaning across time that connect past to present to future through objects that persist while consciousness doesn't, through evidence that we were here even after everyone who remembers us personally is gone. The terracotta warriors still stand in their pits, still face east toward threats that never materialized, still guard an emperor who has been dead for more than 2,000 years. Tourists file past daily, cameras raised, voices hushed by the scale and strangeness of it. Archaeologists continue their work, carefully excavating new sections, developing better preservation techniques, slowly revealing more of the vast underground complex that surrounds the tomb mound. The warriors remain, patient as they have always been, waiting for nothing in particular, simply persisting through time that has erased empires and languages and entire civilizations, but hasn't quite erased them. The tomb itself still waits, sealed beneath Mount Lee, holding secrets that current technology isn't advanced enough to safely reveal. The mercury rivers, if they exist, still flow in darkness. The mechanical devices, if they exist, still function or lie broken after millennia. The emperor's body, preserved or decayed, lies wherever it was placed, surrounded by treasures or by emptiness depending on whether looters ever penetrated that deep. We don't know, won't know for years or decades or perhaps generations because the decision has been made to preserve rather than excavate, to wait until methods improve rather than risk destroying irreplaceable evidence through premature investigation. This patience is itself a form of respect, acknowledgement that some questions can wait, that rushing to answers risks losing information that slower, more careful approaches might preserve. It's also acknowledgement that the tomb has already waited 2 millennia, that another few decades or even centuries is negligible on the scale of its existence, that there's no urgency to satisfy contemporary curiosity when satisfying it might prevent future understanding. The legacy the warriors carry is multiple, layered, changing as time passes and new generations encounter them with different questions and concerns. For Chinese citizens, they're symbols of cultural heritage, proof that Chinese civilization produced world-class achievements, connections to ancestors who built remarkable things. For archaeologists, they're evidence of ancient capabilities, technical sophistication, organizational structures, belief systems about death and the afterlife. For artists, they're inspiration, demonstrations of what human creativity can accomplish, reminders that art serves purposes beyond beauty, that aesthetics and function and meaning intertwine in ways that transcend any single interpretation. For philosophers, the warriors are prompts for reflection about mortality, legacy, the relationship between individual existence and historical time, the ways humans try to transcend biological limits through creation and preparation and hope. For tourists, they're wonders, things to see and photograph, experiences to collect, proof that travel brings encounters with remarkable human achievements. For local residents around Xi'an, they're economic engines, sources of employment and revenue, but also disruptions, changes to landscape and lifestyle, constant reminders that their ordinary place has become extraordinary to outsiders. All these legacies are real, valid, meaningful. The warriors contain multitudes because they're complex enough to support multiple interpretations, because they were created with such care and skill that they reward attention from any angle, because time has added layers of meaning that their creators never intended, but which are no less legitimate for being later additions to original purpose. The warriors teach that the past is never really past, that it persists in physical evidence and cultural memory and ongoing influence, that what was done millennia ago still matters because we make it matter by paying attention, by studying, by caring, by trying to understand what earlier humans were thinking and doing and hoping to achieve. This attention creates connection across time, relationships between present people and past people, mediated through objects that outlasted both, through clay that has become medium for conversation spanning centuries. They also teach that meaning is unstable, that what something means changes depending on who encounters it, and when and in what context. The warriors meant one thing to the artisans who created them, another to the emperor who commissioned them, another to the rebels who may have vandalized them, another to the farmers who accidentally rediscovered them, another to archaeologists who excavate them, another to tourists who visit them, another to you reading about them now. None of these meanings cancels the others. They coexist, accumulate, build understanding that's richer and more nuanced than any single perspective could provide. The future will add more meanings. People not yet born will encounter the warriors with concerns we can't predict, questions we haven't thought to ask, frameworks we haven't developed. They'll find things in the warriors that we missed, will understand aspects that escape us, will create interpretations that seem obvious to them but would surprise us. This is how heritage works, not as fixed, unchanging truth, but as living relationship between present people and past evidence, relationship that evolves as circumstances change and knowledge accumulates. The warriors will outlast us probably, barring catastrophic destruction or environmental collapse. They've survived 2 millennia already, have proven themselves durable enough to persist through wars and dynasty changes and the normal decay that claims most human creations. With proper conservation, they might survive another 2 millennia or more, might be standing in their pits when people look back at our time the way we look back at the Qin Dynasty, finding our civilization as strange and distant as we find theirs, wondering what we were thinking and whether we understood the consequences of our choices. This continuation is the warriors' ultimate achievement, not what they were supposed to do, but what they actually do, which is persist, which is remain present in physical space as evidence that humans were here, that we created things, that we cared about mortality and legacy enough to devote enormous resources to addressing them, that we were creative and skilled and desperate and hopeful and flawed and sometimes remarkable in what we accomplished despite or because of our limitations. They stand in the darkness of their pits, illuminated by artificial lights, viewed by crowds they were never meant to encounter, serving purposes their creators never imagined, successful in ways that weren't intended but which are nonetheless real. They've transcended origin without escaping it, carry their history while accumulating new meanings, remain ancient while becoming contemporary through constant reinterpretation and renewed attention. The emperor they were built to protect is gone, beyond protection, beyond need, beyond existence in any form that consciousness can inhabit. The dynasty he founded collapsed within years of his death. The empire he unified fragmented, then reunified under different rulers with different systems. Everything he tried to control slipped from his control. Everything he tried to preserve decayed or changed, or was deliberately destroyed by people with different priorities. Yet the warriors remain, guarding nothing, protecting nobody, simply being themselves, clay shaped by human hands into forms that reference human bodies, standing in the semblance of military formation, waiting with infinite patience for nothing in particular. Perhaps that's the final lesson they offer, that what we create outlasts our intentions, that meaning exceeds original purpose, that legacy is what others make of what we leave behind rather than what we hoped they'd make of it, that the point isn't to control the future but to engage the present fully enough that what we create has sufficient quality, sufficient care embedded in it, sufficient skill evident in its making, that future people will find it worth preserving, worth studying, worth thinking about, worth standing before in quiet wonder at what humans can accomplish when we try. The warriors will stand through, tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow, patient as stone though made of clay, guarding emptiness that has become fullness through accumulation of attention and meaning, waiting in darkness that has become light through discovery and interpretation, serving an emperor who is dust by serving everyone who looks at them and sees evidence that we are temporary, but what we make might persist, that consciousness ends but form continues, that individual existence is brief, but human capability for creation is profound, and sometimes, against all odds, what we create survives us to tell stories we never intended to people, we never imagined about things that matter more than we knew.